Most people will not understand what happens in 2026 until the moment it detonates. They will look back and wonder how they missed the signs, how they overlooked the warnings, how they trusted a system that was already cracking beneath their feet. Because every debt cycle has a breaking point, a moment when the burden becomes too heavy, when the promises made by governments and institutions can no longer be sustained, and when the illusion of stability collapses under its own weight. That moment is approaching fast, and what is coming is not a mild recession, not a correction, not a temporary shock. It is the 2026 debt detonation scenario, the point at which the financial structure built over decades finally reaches the limits of its endurance. Stay with me. My name is Marcus Blackwell. I am not a financial advisor, but I expose the unseen fragility that governs our world. I follow the long arcs of history, the debt cycles that rise and fall, the empires that stretch beyond their limits, and the currencies that decay quietly until their collapse becomes impossible to ignore. My mission is simple: to help you recognize the patterns long before the headlines arrive, to give you the clarity most people will not have, and to ensure that while others freeze in panic, you remain steady, prepared, and unbreakable. Because history is not random. History repeats in cycles, and today, we are approaching the same phase that preceded the largest financial resets of the last 5 centuries. To understand why 2026 is the breaking point, you must first understand the nature of debt cycles. Every great economy expands through credit. Borrowing fuels growth, raises living standards, funds innovation, and creates stability for a time. But eventually the growth slows, while the debt continues to rise. The system begins to rely not on productivity, but on borrowing. Governments borrow to cover deficits. Consumers borrow to maintain lifestyles. Corporations borrow to inflate valuations. Banks lend aggressively because the system rewards risk, not restraint. This is the expansion phase. It feels good, it feels prosperous, but it is an illusion built on borrowed time. Then the pressure begins. Not chaos, not collapse, just pressure. Interest rates rise because inflation refuses to fall. Governments discover that servicing their debt consumes a growing share of their budgets. Households begin feeling the squeeze as wages fail to keep up with rising costs. Corporations struggle to refinance old loans at higher rates. Banks see early cracks forming in their portfolios. Nothing dramatic, nothing loud. Just the quiet tightening of a system pushed beyond its limits. And then, somewhere deep inside that machinery, the first structural fractures appear. The truth behind the scenes is darker than most people want to believe. The modern financial system is held together by confidence alone. Currency has value because people believe it will have value tomorrow. Government debt functions because investors believe the government will repay it. Banks remain stable because depositors believe their money is safe. Confidence is the foundation. But confidence is fragile. Once it begins to weaken, the system transitions from stability to vulnerability. And once it weakens enough, the system enters the danger zone. That is where we are now. Look at government behavior. They are issuing debt at a staggering pace, not to invest in growth, but simply to avoid collapse. They borrow money to make interest payments on earlier borrowing. They refinance obligations instead of paying them down. They extend and pretend, believing that growth will return and rescue them. But growth is no longer keeping pace with debt. The line has crossed. The burden has outgrown the ability to carry it. This is the late stage of the cycle. The moment when history shows collapse becomes unavoidable without structural change. And structural change is never painless. Look at consumers. Families are relying on credit to pay for everyday necessities. Savings rates are collapsing. Debt is rising. The average person senses something is wrong but cannot articulate it. They feel the uncertainty in rising prices, unstable housing markets, and shrinking purchasing power. They feel the erosion of stability, the quiet realization that the system is no longer working for them. This psychological shift is the earliest sign of a coming breakdown. People lose faith first. The system breaks later. Look at corporations. They are cutting investment, laying off workers, and hoarding cash. This is not the behavior of companies confident in the future. This is the posture of institutions preparing for impact. Many overleveraged companies will not survive higher borrowing costs. They expanded aggressively during the era of near-zero interest rates. Now they must face a reality the system never prepared them for, and when corporations tremble, banks feel the aftershocks. Look at the banks. They are tightening credit even as officials insist the financial system is strong. Banks never restrict lending during healthy cycles. They restrict lending when they sense danger. They see the rising defaults before the public notices them. They see the stress building in commercial real estate. They see the households falling behind on payments. They see the early tremors of the storm, and they respond instinctively. They lower exposure, increase liquidity, and quietly prepare for a wave of instability. Meanwhile, central banks are walking a tightrope with no safe direction. If they lower interest rates to stimulate the economy, inflation will surge again, eroding purchasing power and crushing confidence. If they keep rates high to fight inflation, the cost of servicing debt becomes unbearable, pushing governments, corporations, and households toward breaking points. Every path leads to instability. Every decision accelerates the pressure. This is how a debt detonation builds, slowly, invisibly, then explosively. 2026 is not a random date. It is the mathematical intersection of rising debt, rising interest rates, slowing growth, declining trust, and geopolitical fragmentation. It is the moment when the debt burden becomes too heavy for governments to manage without extraordinary measures. It is the moment when refinancing becomes impossible without consequences. It is the moment when the financial system enters the final stage of the cycle. And the final stage is always the same, either revaluation or rupture. But here is where the story grows even more dangerous. The world is no longer unified under a single financial architecture. Nations are divided into competing blocks. Some are preparing alternative payment systems. Some are reducing their reliance on the United States dollar. Some are stockpiling gold. Some are forming alliances designed to survive the next era of financial instability. And this fragmentation adds fuel to the fire. Because when nations disagree on the future, the present becomes unstable. Imagine a world where governments cannot borrow cheaply, where households cannot afford rising interest costs, where corporations cannot refinance their loans, and where banks refuse to expand credit. That world is not hypothetical. It is emerging right now, piece by piece, month by month. And by 2026, the pressures that have been building for years may reach their unavoidable breaking point. The debt detonation scenario does not happen in one moment. It builds through a series of smaller cracks: a failed bond auction, a sovereign downgrade, a wave of corporate defaults, a sudden liquidity freeze, a geopolitical shock that pushes energy prices out of balance, a bank under stress, a currency weakening faster than expected. These events are not isolated. They are connected threads, woven into a single pattern. When enough threads weaken, the entire fabric tears. We are approaching that tear. Stay with me, because this is where the picture sharpens. The 2026 debt detonation scenario is not about one event. It is about the convergence of multiple forces that have been accelerating for years. Forces that are now colliding in a way the modern world has never experienced simultaneously. On their own, each force is manageable. Together, they create a systemic breaking point. And central banks, governments, corporations, and financial institutions all feel it coming, even if they refuse to say it publicly. To understand the magnitude of this moment, you need to look at the core pressure: interest on national debt. Governments used to borrow for projects, for infrastructure, for emergencies. Today they borrow to survive. They borrow to make interest payments on existing debt. They borrow because their obligations exceed their revenues. They borrow because the system requires endless expansion to function. But when interest rates rise, even by modest amounts, the cost of servicing all that debt explodes. In 2026, many nations will be paying more in interest than they spend on defense, healthcare, education, or infrastructure. That is not the sign of a stable system. That is the sign of a system entering fiscal compression, the phase where debt becomes heavier every time the government attempts to reduce it. At that point, collapse is not an event, it is a mathematical certainty. But governments are not the only ones facing a cliff. Households are walking the same path. For years, easy credit masked the true cost of living. Mortgages were affordable because borrowing was cheap. Cars were affordable because interest rates were negligible. Businesses offered pay raises, but inflation erased them before they could make a difference. And now, millions of families find themselves caught in an economic vice. Their incomes are flat. Their expenses rise. Their debt grows. Their savings vanish. And when the average person feels squeezed, the entire system weakens because consumer confidence is the lifeblood of economic growth. When confidence falls, spending falls. When spending falls, businesses shrink. When businesses shrink, layoffs begin. When layoffs begin, defaults accelerate. This cascade is already forming. Commercial real estate is another silent fracture. Many properties purchased during the era of near-zero interest rates must be refinanced in the coming years. But these buildings will not refinance at the same terms. Their borrowing costs will skyrocket. Their valuations will fall. Their revenues will not keep pace. This will trigger a wave of defaults, weighing heavily on banks already stressed by rising consumer delinquencies. Banks will respond the same way they always do when stress rises. They will contract. They will protect themselves. They will pull back credit, freezing the lifeblood of the economy. This is another domino in the 2026 detonation chain. Meanwhile, the geopolitical environment is no longer stable. Trade routes are shifting. Energy markets are volatile. Alliances are realigning. Nations are weaponizing currencies. Supply chains are fragmenting. Each of these forces adds uncertainty, and uncertainty multiplies the probability of financial instability. Historical analysis shows that financial systems are most vulnerable during moments of global tension. And today, global tension is not a passing moment. It is the new normal. This is why central banks are struggling. They are caught between two impossible choices. If they cut rates too early, inflation will surge again, weakening currencies and eroding public trust. If they keep rates high for too long, debt becomes unmanageable and the system collapses under the weight of its own obligations. They are attempting to balance a scale that cannot be balanced. The window for smooth correction has already closed. The only question now is how controlled the transition will be. This is where 2026 becomes the breaking point. It is the year when multiple maturities converge, when critical refinancing deadlines hit, when households run out of savings, when governments face historic budget pressures, when interest costs peak, and when central banks can no longer artificially stabilize every part of the economy simultaneously. It is the year when the margin of error disappears. It is the point at which the pressure exceeds the system's ability to contain it. But here is the truth most analysts avoid. Collapses do not begin with chaos. They begin with silence, quiet tightening, quiet hesitation, quiet withdrawals. Once the public senses danger, even faintly, behavior shifts. People begin saving more, spending less, borrowing less, and preparing in subtle ways. Every one of these behaviors is rational individually, but collectively, they accelerate the very crisis people hope to avoid. And once confidence breaks, it does not recover quickly. It unravels like a thread pulled from a fabric already stretched thin. Yet this is not the time for fear. This is the time for clarity. Because every great collapse in history has produced survivors who emerged stronger than before. And the reason they survived was simple. They understood the cycle before the cycle overwhelmed them. They acted early. They positioned themselves ahead of the transition. They reduced their fragile debt. They diversified their assets. They built liquidity. They developed skills and income sources that were resilient rather than dependent on a single employer or industry. They avoided the trap of believing that the future would look exactly like the past. Preparation does not mean predicting a date. It means recognizing a trajectory. And today, the trajectory is unmistakable. Debt is rising faster than income. Interest costs are rising faster than revenue. Governments are losing control over their budgets. Households are losing control over their finances. Banks are losing control over credit expansion. Central banks are losing control over inflation. And the world is losing trust in the very institutions that hold the financial system together. This is not speculation. This is structural. So what happens next? The detonation scenario does not destroy everything. It resets everything. It reorganizes priorities. It forces governments to restructure debt, often painfully. It forces central banks to adopt new frameworks. It forces currencies to revalue. It forces societies to rethink spending, borrowing, and economic growth. These transitions are difficult, but they are not unprecedented. Every empire, every currency, every financial order reaches this point eventually. The only difference is how prepared the people are when the transition arrives. You have a choice at this moment. You can pretend nothing is happening, like countless individuals who were blindsided by the crises of 1929, 1971, 2008, and every other turning point in financial history. Or you can position yourself wisely, quietly, and deliberately. You can become one of the few individuals who refuses to repeat history's mistakes. Before you go, pause for a moment. Not out of fear, out of clarity. Because everything we just walked through is not abstract theory or distant history. It is already showing up in daily life. Higher prices that never seem to come back down. Markets that feel less stable than they used to. Rules that change quietly, without explanation. These are not random frustrations. They are signals. Here's the question most people avoid asking. If this system is under strain, where do you feel it first? Is it at the grocery store, in housing, in energy bills, in savings, or in that growing sense that the future feels less predictable than it did even a few years ago? I want you to think about that, and then scroll down and leave a comment. Not slogans, not politics, real experience, because when people answer honestly, patterns emerge, and awareness spreads faster than panic ever could. If this video helped you see the world differently, take a second to hit the like button. It helps this message reach people who need it before they are forced to learn it the hard way. And if you want to stay ahead of what history is signaling next, subscribe and stay close. These shifts do not announce themselves loudly. They reward the prepared. Most importantly, share this with someone you care about. A family member, a close friend, someone who still believes everything happening right now is temporary or random, not to scare them, to inform them. Because the conversations we have early are the ones that matter most later. When you understand the past, the future stops being frightening. It becomes predictable. And remember this: the wise prepare quietly, while the unprepared panic for all to see.